From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. And today we're going to be talking about the U.S. election and U.S. Middle East policy under the Biden administration. Thankfully, we've got two great guests on the program today to help us make sense of things. Paul Salem and Randa Slim. Paul is MEI's president, and Randa is a senior fellow and the director of MEI's Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program. Paul, Randa, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you both very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. Great to be here.
Paul, it was a long, drawn-out process, but now that we finally know the results from last week's election, what are your initial takeaways? What does a Biden victory mean for U.S. policy toward the Middle East?
Well, I think one sort of general effect is that it was a democratic event, democratic in the broad sense, not Democratic Party, that this was an event where 150 million almost citizens came out, expressed their views. And although it was a close election, and maybe a little bit of it is still not completely resolved, the public decided to remove the leader and select a different leader. That very basic and simple fact, I think, continues to resonate around the world and would continue to resonate in the Middle East, a country where people generally do not have the capacity to select their leaders, renew their leaders, or remove their leaders. And we've seen in the last decade in cases where large, maybe majorities or groups of populations wanted to do just that, either, had to go through years of protest or uprising and death and incarceration, or the country collapsed into civil war. So that simple kind of something that maybe is taken for granted, that a country and a people could make such momentous and historic decisions in a very simple, direct way by showing up at your local library or local school and saying, I want this person or that person, and history changes. I think that is still very, very important around the world. The Middle East is still struggling over what type of political system will end up being the dominant one. And I would say it's three different models. One is the straightforward kind of authoritarian with a developmental orientation to it, kind of what you might increasingly call the Chinese model. The other model is the Islamic or Islamist model, which comes in different shapes and forms, whether in Iran or Muslim Brotherhood version or parts of Erdogan's version. And the third is, those who actually want a simple democracy, as it were. And I think so. This event in itself, regardless of who Biden is and what he's going to do, which we'll talk about, is important and should not be overlooked.
Randa, I suspect there will be a number of differences in terms of both style and substance from the Trump administration, but what are the key policy changes that you expect from a Biden administration?
Let me also comment on the question that you asked, Paul. I think I would like to add, I second everything that Paul has said in terms of how these elections were viewed and in the Middle East and their impact on the people in the Middle East in terms of the lessons learned from it or what they take away from it. I think also there are 3 points I would like to make, if possible. One is, especially the youth group are really, learning lessons about the power of organizing, that even though you have a president who had access to the enormous resources of the government institutions, yet, organizing at the local level has been able to make up for that inequities in resources that the two candidates had. Second is the power of local officials in small counties in Pennsylvania or in Georgia or in Arizona, basically coming up on TV and saying, the president cannot dictate the results of the elections. The voters dictate the results of the election. And standing up against a presidential narrative about, and we are talking about Republican and Democratic officials. I think that's an important and powerful lesson. And then the third is the nonviolent character. People picture after pictures on TV in the Middle East of people standing up in line for 4 or 5 hours peacefully, dancing sometime together, waiting to vote. And even after a long period of divisive politics and in the midst of divisive politics in the region. So I think the example that this was shown to the rest of the world, including the Middle East, is very hopeful about America being back. And that's what we heard, from around the world. America is back. Welcome back, America. It's the America that you know. And this image, this idea of America has really received a boost with these elections. So coming back to your questions, I think in terms of style, all you have to do is look at the transition team website that has been put up by the Biden campaign. While the big headline is restoring America's leadership, if you look at the 4 priorities they listed, it's primarily domestic, except for one, but also partly one. One is the COVID pandemic. 2 is economic recovery. 3 is racial equities and working on racial justice. And 4th is climate change both in its domestic and international components, including the Middle East.
Paul, on that point, President Biden will obviously have a lot on his plate. How important do you think the Middle East will be compared to the other priorities that Randa just enumerated? And how much of a focus overall do you think there will be on international issues?
Well, as Randa said, all the big priorities are either domestic, and Randa listed them, and on the foreign policy priorities, some are sort of globalistic, as in climate change or even fighting the pandemic, where others relate to great power competition, really the priority of figuring out relations and competition with China, as well as Russia. If you look also at the platform of the Democratic Party and you look at the foreign policy section or the whole platform, which I forget is 50 pages, 60 pages, on the very last page, the very last few paragraphs, it's the Middle East. So you can see, that's partly because the Middle East is not anything that the public is interested in. They're kind of fed up with hearing about problems in the Middle East. So it's certainly not a popular thing to win an election. And there are also very few good options in the Middle East. Having said that, a couple of things. First, in terms of procedure, we have to still await the outcome of a couple of Senate races. It looks like the Republican Party will retain control of the Senate, but it's not absolutely certain. If the Republicans do, then a President Biden is going to have to basically negotiate a little bit with the leaders of the Republican Party if he wants to get anything done, particularly domestically. That would mean that his administration might be more of a centrist administration. If the Democrats win the Senate, a possibility, maybe not very likely, then a Biden administration would not need to negotiate with any Republicans, as it were, and would have control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, and they could go off in somewhat different direction, particularly responding to priorities that the Democratic base or the left wing, whatever you want to call it, is insisting on. Now, that might not have direct consequences in Middle East policy, but might have some. But let's talk about sort of the general direction of Middle East policy under a Biden administration. First of all, it's not a mystery. Biden was in the White House just 4 years ago and participated in foreign policy for the previous 8 years. Almost his entire foreign policy team, or most of it certainly, was also in different positions just 4 years ago. So it's not guesswork. The main difference is likely to come on Iran. President Biden has made it clear he wants to find a way back to the JCPOA if Iran returns to compliance itself. He also wants to strengthen the nuclear deal. Obviously, his approach is more restorative and then attempt to build on that with a combination of pressure and diplomacy with Iran to extend sunset clauses and so on for the nuclear deal and bring to the table Iranian missile program and Iran's presence in the Middle East. This will certainly not be easy, and much of it will depend on how the Iranians respond, how the Iranian elections go, and so on. In terms of relations with Israel, I think there's a continuity there, although with a change of politics and tone. It's obvious that Netanyahu was a Trump supporter, Trump booster, was an opponent of Obama openly and spoke in Congress against Obama when Obama was pursuing his foreign policy agenda in the Middle East. So I think there's a personal question mark there as to how these two leaders will move on from that political problem. The failure of Trump to win re-election certainly weakens Netanyahu in Israel and might cloud his political future. A similar problem, I think, exists particularly in Saudi Arabia, where the leadership there embraced Trump and his family, and I would say was openly, clearly supportive that Trump would win. Again, there, particularly after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi and the big impact that's had in the United States, how President Biden and a Crown Prince Hamad bin Salman will manage that, what remains a key relationship for both countries. They cannot walk away from it, but very difficult personal relations. I also think we have to see an interesting point who ends up being Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and now an increasingly important position in foreign policy, Secretary of the Treasury, which uses sanctions, as we've seen in the last months and years, as a weapon of foreign policy. So still a lot to unpack, but I think the main change will be on Iran, and then more, I would say, secondary changes in other areas of policy.
Randa, taking a high-level view of the region at the end of 2020, what do you see as the most pressing issues for the U.S. in the region right now?
Well, if we take what Mr. Biden principal advisors, foreign policy advisors have said, definitely the Middle East is going to occupy a lower priority place in the U.S. foreign policy going forward. Let me quote here an interview done by CFR with Anthony Blinken. And quote, he says, time allocation and budget priorities, we would be doing less, not more in the Middle East, end of quote. But the Middle East has always found in the past a way to impose itself on every US presidential agenda, even when the president, as was the case with Mr. Obama, was interested in rebalancing our foreign policy priorities toward Asia. I think what we are going to see is pressing priorities in the Middle East, but also I don't know if there will be an administration that's interested in pursuing this. Now, what I would like to add to what Paul has said is, again, based on what his foreign policy advisors have said in previous interviews in the past, the priority is going to be on the Indo-Pacific region, the Americas, sustained engagement with Africa, and of course, repairing the transatlantic relationship with the old European partners. They look at the Middle East primarily, and I think that's a wide consensus inside the Democratic Party, because I think with Vice President Kamala Harris, which brings to the table in the White House the progressive wing of the party, whereas Mr. Biden brings more the centrist, moderate wing of the party, I think there will be more emphasis on issues that have bipartisan consensus within the party. Not bipartisan, I would say, that has the consensus within the Democratic Party, progressives and Democrats on. And one of these issues is ending forever wars in Afghanistan, ending forever wars in the Middle East. Mr. Biden's typical approach, especially in places like Syria and Iraq, has been to focus on presence of small special operation forces to help local forces, local allies in fighting terrorism, for example, in Syria and Iraq. I think we are going to see also more emphasis on climate change in our foreign policy, because that, again, enjoys wide consensus within the Democratic Party. You are going to see emphasis also on elevating diplomacy, economy, education, health in foreign policy, and not downgrading, but putting less emphasis on use of military force as an instrument of advancing US interest. And you are going to see interest also on engaging with wider representation of people, civil societies in countries of the Middle East. Not only is it going to be also in our foreign policy, but also in our domestic policy. For example, his foreign policy advisors have been talking about the importance of having groups in the United States like environmentalists, like labor unions, like civil society, human rights organizations, sitting at the table, making decisions about US foreign policy. These groups have their counterparts in the Middle East, and they would be engaging with them. So we would expect also the perspective of these groups in the Middle East to be reflected even more in the making of US foreign policy.
Paul, I know this is a bit of a big question, but what are the key lessons for you for the new administration that it should learn from the mistakes of both Obama and Trump when it comes to dealing with the Middle East?
Well, there's lessons to be learned from the Obama administration and some of his advisors who were with the Obama administration. I've been talking about that. And of course, there's lessons to be learned from the Trump 4 years. From the Obama administration, a couple of things that are lessons learned to my mind. One is the experience in Syria, that a lot of the officials who were there and who were involved have second thoughts, have regrets about how horrific the situation in Syria ended up, and how Obama's policy, while defensible and logical on its own, ended up creating horrific consequences and certainly did not contribute to any sort of denouement of that crisis. There's a commitment in this new group to try to reinvigorate the political track. I'm maybe not very hopeful that the Assad regime will cooperate at all, but at least giving it another very serious attempt to nudge Syria from the horrific division and situation it's in now to something a bit more livable for its population. I think, in terms of the deal with Iran, I think there are lessons learned there too. That while the deal in itself is, I think is, yes, you can quibble. There are some details here and there, but I do think many in the administration of Obama who are now with Biden underestimated the degree to which Iran would pocket the deal and then escalate in other areas. Obviously, they were hoping for a moderation in Iranian foreign policy. That certainly did not take place. A third area is in dealing with Turkey. As you recall, one of Obama's first forays or speeches in the Middle East was in Turkey, and at the time holding up the Turkish model as as an example of a Muslim majority country that's democratic, that's globalized its economy, all of that. And maybe at the time, Erdogan represented some of that. I think where they see Erdogan's leadership now, the AKP, the serious movement towards political Islam, support of very radical groups, use of militias, basically becoming a second Iran in some cases, is is something they will have to rethink in a big way. From the Trump administration, I mean, there are successes and failures. On the success side, I think the Trump administration's approach, the outside in approach, as they call it, to the Israeli Palestinian and Israeli Arab conflict, it had been kind of tradition to think that no progress in Israeli Arab relations could be made unless and until. Now, Trump pursued a horrific policy against the Palestinians, and that has terrible consequences. And the Biden administration is committed to restoring relations with the Palestinian Authority, funding and financing Palestinian relief and institutions, and so all of that, and opening the Palestinian Representation Office in Washington. That's absolutely necessary. But I think the breakthroughs in terms of relations between some of the Arab countries and Israel is something the administration will build on. So a success to build on, other failures to avoid. On Iran, while they profoundly obviously disagreed on the Trump administration's departure from the nuclear deal, and that certainly did not positively move Iran away from a nuclear option. Rather, Iran is now closer to a bomb than when the deal prevailed. But at the same time, the Trump administration showed how much leverage the US by itself can have over Iran. The failure of the Trump administration was not using that leverage for diplomatic or political gain, but rather just leverage for leverage's sake and causing suffering and pain in Iran. I think the Biden administration can use some of that leverage, some of the many sanctions, which will continue even if the US returns to the JCPOA, to engage with Iran, maintain that pressure in order to move Iran in a more productive direction. Now, that's difficult. Iran's a very difficult country, but Trump leaves the Biden administration with some tools that they could pick up and perhaps use. Another, I think, very important, and I'll end this comment with this, is the Trump administration led with threats, military action, and sanctions. Yes, those bring you leverage and they're important in the mix, but there really was no powerful diplomacy, particularly on the Iranian side, but also on ending any of the civil wars, whether it's Yemen or Libya or Syria. There was effort in Afghanistan, but not in Yemen, which is the biggest humanitarian crisis. I think the Biden administration definitely is going to foreground diplomacy. Diplomacy is the key to success in foreign policy, and I think that's necessary in the Iranian case. It's desperately necessary to de escalate and try to end the civil war in Yemen, which is doable. It is very necessary and doable in Libya. It's necessary in Syria, although, as I said, I'm less optimistic.
More of a carrot and a stick approach as opposed to an all stick approach.
Something like that.
Rhonda, we've spoken about the changing views among the American public on the involvement in the Middle East and the desire to end forever wars. But what about the perception of the United States in the region? How have they changed over the past 4 years, and how will that affect what President Biden can achieve?
Look, I think that's also another thing that President Biden is inheriting from the Trump administration is not only a divided country, deeply polarized, but also a world that's increasingly in disarray, including the Middle East. I mean, the region is experiencing a crisis of governance in its institutions. There is deep mistrust between governed and governors, and that has started with the Arab Spring, when Mr. Biden was in the White House as vice president, and it continues through a number of waves. And I think the Middle East looks at Mr. Biden through also that legacy, the legacy of the Obama administration in Syria, the legacy of the Obama administration in Egypt, the legacy of the Obama administration in Tunisia. But at the same time, I think the Middle East is relieved that there is an administration that's not only looking at sanctions, force as instruments of advancing its national interest. They will be welcoming an administration also, that will elevate diplomacy, that will elevate economic development, that will elevate emphasis on health, on education, innovation. And so I think it is wait and see. So it's a mixed bag. There is a past that Mr. Biden brings certain a baggage, from the Iraq war again to the Arab Spring that leaves many people in the Middle East a little bit anxious about what Mr. Biden will be bringing in terms of his foreign policy. But there is also the emphasis of the Biden administration on democracy, on human rights, on engaging with citizens, civil societies. As his advisor said, there is a choice that administration have to make, a choice between authoritarians and peoples who are standing up against them. And a Biden administration will make the right call by standing with people, against authoritarian. And so, so it's wait and see. That again, there is anxiety from the past, but there is also hope about the future.
Question for both of you. If you were advising the new administration on policy, which issue or area that has previously been overlooked would you recommend that the U.S. spend more time and resources on, and why? Paul, maybe starting with you.
Yeah, I'll just give a sort of a broad picture that the problem of the Middle East boils down to the absence of any regional order. If we don't, we, by mean, not only the US, it's not doable just from one side, but if we don't arrive to a Middle East which is better integrated, which has relations among the states of the region and is stabilizing as a system, we're going to be putting out fires for decades to come. Currently, the Middle East has three conflict axes. There's a whole axis of conflict with Iran involving many states of the region. There's a conflict axis or an alliance between sort of Israel and the Gulf states and some others, which is in conflict with the Iran axis. And there's another Turkish, Qatari, Muslim Brotherhood kind of axis. So this is a region where three axes are at war. The states of the region, generally the main ones that are in conflict, do not talk to each other. There is no diplomacy really between them. The Middle East is a region in civil war with itself. I think for the US, which remains the most influential player in the Middle East and in the world, there should be a recognition that the problem is systemic and that although it will take time, we should go in the direction of encouraging all the countries of the region and pressuring them to initiate diplomatic negotiations with each other, to get used to talking to each other, to de-escalate conflict with each other. I think we should sanction, in other words, kind of punish or press any country that's deploying proxy forces or troops or direct military support to any other country in the region. We should begin encouraging the setting of rules in the region so that at some point, the Middle East becomes a zone of stability, like most other zones of the world, and doesn't export problems all the time. I think obviously that's not something easy to do, but I'm also alarmed, or I was, concerned during the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and in the discussions with the entering Biden team, is that there's a lot of very good policy ideas at I would, what I would call the bilateral or micro level, but there is no macro strategic vision of where the Middle East needs to get to. And where Obama left off, which was, well, you need to learn to live with each other, which has a kernel of truth in it, but it'll take more than that to have an organized Middle East.
Randa, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly support every word that Paul said. And again, I share his concern that, again, from talking with the incoming foreign policy officials in the Biden administration, reading what some of their writings, is that there is not only a lack of strategic vision, but also there is this view that only the region should do that the United States, can support, can maybe, convince, but United States is not going to invest in pushing this process that Paul talked about, the region healing its conflicts, working together, dialoguing with each other. And, I have some news for them. If the United States does not engage in doing that, does not push allies and adversaries alike and deploy some of its leverage it has with both in order to push them toward the negotiation path, it's not going to happen. And so I'm hoping that once they are in office, given the fact that they are going to have a limited bandwidth for foreign policy in general, given the priorities at home with the pandemics, with the economic recovery, with the racial, equities, with the racial inequities, I think hopefully they will come to the realization, as Paul said, a need for a macro strategic vision, but also a realization that the U.S. need to invest. There is a premium for U.S. engagement, U.S. being at the table, pushing allies and adversaries that we need to exercise in order to move this region toward the stable order that is good, that is in U.S. national interest, and that's good for the peoples of the region.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but Randa, Paul, thank you both for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.